The Australian government is pushing through major new ASIO reforms that could permanently expand the powers of the national intelligence apparatus. The government says the threat landscape has changed: terrorism, extremism, foreign interference, cyber warfare, communal violence. And because of that, intelligence agencies say they need stronger powers to act before attacks happen and not after. But critics warn something much bigger may be happening beneath the surface, because these laws don't just affect terrorists, they could affect journalists, researchers, activists, political movements, online speech, and ordinary Australians who may never even be accused of a crime. On this episode, we break down the ASIO Amendment Bills, compulsory questioning powers, the removal of sunset clauses, freedom of speech concerns, hate speech laws, oversight mechanisms, and the growing fear that modern democracies are building permanent security state powers that may never fully roll back. What counts as extremism? Who decides what becomes a national security threat? And at what point does protecting democracy begin changing the nature of democracy itself? The episode starts now. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you are a repeat offender, welcome back. If the intro wasn't obvious enough, on tonight's episode we're going to be having a deep and detailed look at ASIO's proposed Amendment Bill No. 2. What is it? What does it do? Why is it being proposed? And what it could mean for everyday Australians. I'll be breaking down what the proposed new amendment bill actually does, where it came from, the history behind it, how it affects free speech and online speech, as well as a few hypothetical examples of where it can go really wrong. And as history has taught us, when bills like this are introduced, they are very rarely rolled back. Amendment Bill 2 does propose some pretty draconian new laws, but are they really necessary? And have the security agencies in this country gone too far? And why are they being proposed now? In a time where hate speech laws and freedom of speech is being stepped on, it seems like every week. Why all of a sudden is this draconian new bill being proposed right now? These are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer on tonight's episode. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is episode 102 of The Truth Tank, ASIO Amendment Bill No. 2, Free Speech and the Permanent Security State Question. Australia is currently considering two linked bills: Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, also known as ASIO, Amendment Bill No. 1, proposed in 2025, and Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Amendment Bill No. 2, also proposed in 2025. According to the Parliamentary Library Bills Digest of 2025 and 2026, Bill No. 1 extends existing compulsory questioning warrants under the ASIO Act of 1979 right through until March 2027. Bill No. 2 reforms the framework itself, including removal of the sunset clause and the expansion of authorised grounds for questioning. And I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty scary. It sounds like the security agencies want even more power than they already have. And they keep telling us they're underfunded and they need more public funding, and yet things like Bondi happen and they don't have a good excuse why there wasn't more intelligence done on the two perpetrators. And me being an adamant supporter of free speech, this new proposed bill sends up a lot of red flags. I think speech has been controlled enough. There's already too many hate speech laws. There were already hate speech laws in place that people, I know, seemingly just forgot about. I was very skeptical when the government brought in the new hate speech laws at the start of the year. I thought they were really stretching because like I just mentioned, we already had existing hate speech laws that worked. They were just never really enacted properly. I covered that on a previous episode on the Bondi Massacre Part 2, I think. I used an example of a football fan abusing an Indigenous or African football player. He could have been charged with hate speech under the existing laws, and rightfully so, but he wasn't. A lot of legal advocates suggest that the reasoning for this is because it's just not worth the time and effort having to arrest someone like that, drag them down to the station, question them, then fill out the paperwork. This isn't a negative reflection on the police either. The police are overworked. They have more important, more dangerous criminals to stop. It seems like every time you turn the news on, someone's been attacked by a machete in Melbourne, or there's a cigarette shop or a bottle shop or something going up in flames in Melbourne, or there's a shooting or another assassination of a underworld figure in Western Sydney. The police have enough things to do, so I can understand why a non-violent crime isn't taken as seriously. Now, fast forward until the start of this year, and our Prime Minister, Commissar Albanese, brought in new rushed hate speech laws that both sides of politics agreed on. Despite the Liberal Party saying on the record that they were going to oppose the new law changes because it did step on freedom of speech. They went back on their word in a 12th hour decision and decided to side with the Labor Party. And effectively, a lot of free speech has been crushed in this country. You can literally do jail time for saying certain banned slogans or questioning certain protected groups. And that isn't freedom of speech as I understand it. That's not freedom of speech in a democratic, free country like Australia. And these new hate speech laws have been popping up globally. So it's not just Australia that's been affected. It seems like the entire Western world is being cracked down on. And before I get too conspiratorial, I urge you to do your own research, because if you don't believe me, just fucking look some of these bills up, because they really straddle the line between quote-unquote security and policing and Orwellian totalitarianism. And history is always the greatest guide to where these things go, but no one really wants to pay attention because the example has already been set. This is the same shit fascist organizations and governments across the world have done. The communists in Russia did it. They labeled their enemy as the whites and didn't treat them like human. They were the enemy. Their opinion didn't count. They were treated as the enemy and labeled as less than human. So therefore, whatever you do to them is okay. The Nazis did the same thing. I don't think I have to go too much into that, but they labeled the other side. They were the superior force, and they were going to bring about change, and it was a kind of a join or die mentality. Those that resisted were chucked into prison or killed, and it seems like every so many years this poisonous ideology resurfaces, and we're seeing a very similar thing happen in modern-day politics in the Western world. The governments in charge are very quick to label the other side as quote-unquote nationalists or racists or whatever labeling they want to throw at the opposition. Now, the reason they do that is obvious. They wanted to They want to discredit the other side. They don't want any opposition to their own agenda or ideas. And this is coming from someone who voted for Anthony Albanese. I did believe he could bring change. I didn't think it would be a Orwellian communist change. He presented himself as a man of the people, for the people, but has really just proven that he is a corporate shill, ready to spread his legs for whatever corporation or lobbying group throws money at him. He does not give two fucks about the Australian people. The whole Labor Party has become very corporate, which is exactly what the Liberal Party used to be like. They were all about protecting big business and fucking over the little guy. And it seems like the Liberal and Labor Party are more or less the same entity now. They're two sides of the same coin. They have very similar aligning theologies. Under Anthony Albanese's government, he has banned more things than any other Prime Minister I can remember. He's banned social media. He's effectively banned the porn sites in Australia. He's cracking down on free speech. And I'm certain he wants to come after YouTube, podcasters, and AI if he could get his own way. He doesn't like being made fun of with AI, which is very fucking funny if you haven't seen it. He doesn't want opposition to his ideas. He doesn't want people calling him names or saying things about him. I think he is a narcissist. He's a covert narcissist. He's managed to hide very well until the last 6 months to a year. And I think he's been exposed just how sensitive he is. He definitely has an axe to grind with the Australian people. And I don't believe anything that a politician says anyway. You really have to take whatever they say with a very, very large amount of salt. The yearly budget was released a week ago, and it's caused a massive controversy and stir in the country. They've really come after the everyday Australian, especially small business owners. They got rid of negative gearing and the capital gains tax, which they promised they wouldn't do when they were campaigning, and they've gone back on their own word. So what is their word worth at this point? Jack shit. I do find it really concerning that free speech seems to be under attack all throughout the Western world. Governments want to crack down on what you can and can't say. They want to control what you see online. And yeah, there is an argument to be made for that, which I won't go into right now. But what happened to freedom of choice? Because by that definition, the government says we're too dumb and untrustworthy to make our own decisions. We need to have them made for us. And so far, the social media ban has kind of been a bit of a furphy because teenagers do what teenagers do. They found a way around it. So that hasn't quite had the effect that I think they thought it was going to. It'd be interesting to see if it's actually worked or not. And when we get to December this year, it'll be a year since the ban came into effect, which should be enough time to get the first preliminary data points to say if this has had a positive or a negative effect. And yeah, like I said, there is an argument for it. It is good on one hand, but it's also bad on the other. I covered this on an episode I did a while back. And as I mentioned on that episode, social media isn't the problem, the algorithm is, and how these tech companies do business. They show you the negative shit because you know you're going to click on it. It's not so much that social media is the problem, because social media has a lot of benefits too. It's what the algorithm feeds you. And if the government targeted the business practices of and the algorithm of these social media giants, rather than going after teenagers who use these apps, maybe I'd be more inclined to believe that they had the quote-unquote best interest of young people at heart. But to me, it just comes off like more control, more censorship, and I believe it is going to be the start of a internet suppression campaign. The under-16 social media ban was the first step. Next, it will be YouTube, and this has been proposed overseas in Europe about silencing certain YouTubers and only pushing government-approved and paid-for content first before you go onto YouTube to see a creator you follow. That's the second phase. Podcasting will be next, and then we'll have a complete censored internet that's controlled by the government. And we all know governments lie. Look at the pandemic. You look at what's happened in the past 10 years and how chaotic and controlling governments have become. They really want to crack down on free speech because they're scared of alternative voices. It looks like Albanese's government is really terrified of alternative voices because mass media has failed. It's lied too much. It doesn't have any legitimacy left anymore. So people are searching for news and opinions from outside these approved media sources that are all controlled by billionaires and the government. And they're looking for alternative voices such as podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs, or whatever it happens to be. I guess to a point, I can consider myself alternative media. There's probably people listening to this show trying to get the truth of a situation, no pun intended, because the mainstream media doesn't cover shit like this. I haven't heard it mentioned once on a traditional news service. I've heard about this on social media, then I've gone down a rabbit hole and done my own research to find out what it means. I don't just take a couple of YouTubers or content creators' opinions as gospel. I have to look into it myself, which has led me to this episode. But enough about that. I think I've ranted and raved enough. Let's get back at looking at Bill number 2. So according to aph.gov.au, Parliamentary Business Bills legislation, which is a government-run website, the ASIO Amendment Bill No. 1 amends the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Act of 1979 to extend the current sunsetting date of Division 3 of Part 3 compulsory questioning powers for an additional 18 months until the 7th of March 2027. This will allow the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, to continue to access Division 3 powers while more substantive reforms to Division 3 progress through Parliament. So that doesn't read too positive to me. So sounds like they already have these powers. They end in March of next year, but they want to extend them beyond the March 7th deadline. And as that second passage just said, this will allow the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, to continue to access Division 3 powers while more fucking hell, why is it so hard to say? I'm just going to say substantial reforms to Division 3 progress through Parliament. So what are these reforms? What are they proposing on top of what I see as an already oppressive bill? As part of the more substantive reforms, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Amendment Bill No. 2 of 2025 amends the ASIO Act to make more comprehensive amendments to Division 3. These include removing the sunset provision, which is currently contained in Section 34JF. The sunset provision has been extended 5 times since it was originally introduced in 2003. Interesting. So, in a post-9/11 world. Expanding the scope of adult questioning warrants to include new grounds, including sabotage and promotion of communal violence, on which individuals can be compulsorily questioned. Amendments relating to, quote, prescribed authorities, in parentheses, being persons who supervise the questioning process, including new disqualifying criteria, and new requirements for compulsory questioning and circumstances where a person has been charged or where such a charge is imminent. A lot of legal mumbo jumbo, so what does that actually fucking mean? And I'm going to leave a link to this in the show notes so you can read the entire webpage on the purpose and the structure of the bills. I'm not going to read it out now because it'll take me all day. It's quite comprehensive. But I've covered what the bill is proposing in this episode. But if you want more context, the link is in the show notes and you can read the whole spiel from the government and make up your own mind. Before we go any further, let's go back in time for a minute and have a look at the original bill that started us down this path, ASIO Act 1979. The ASIO Act of 1979 is the governing statute for Australia's domestic intelligence agency. Under the Act, ASIO's core function is defined as obtaining, correlating, and evaluating intelligence relevant to security, and that security includes espionage, sabotage, politically motivated violence, promotion of communal violence, attacks on Australia's defence systems. So all reasonable stuff. I don't think there's too many people that would disagree that we do need a security apparatus in this country that does prevent or try to minimise espionage, sabotage, politically motivated violence, etc., etc. The one I will call out is promotion of communal violence. What does that actually mean? I mean, does that include someone just making a stupid comment online? Is that considered promoting communal violence or an act of terrorism now? Because we're living in a time where people are fucking pissed off. They've had enough of the lies and bullshit from government, from the media. Everyone wants to rip you off. Everyone wants to tell you what to do, and no one wants to tell you the truth. So I don't think suppressing people's right to vent and be frustrated and angry should be cracked down on so heavily. Because I'll say it again, one of the biggest issues I had with the hate speech laws is they're trying to put a law into place that is suppressing human emotion. And when you suppress human emotion, that never ever fucking goes well. Because we already live in an age where you can't say this, you can't say that. That might offend this group. The blue hairs might get upset with you, or whatever the fuck that group over there identifies with. We've all become too fucking sensitive and interested in other people's business and sexuality. Why the fuck can't we just stick to our own lanes, do our own thing, say what you want, as long as it's not too hateful or inciting violence or harm against an individual? Why don't we let common sense prevail for once? No one should be threatened with violence. I mean, I don't like bullies. I don't think online bullying is acceptable. I think those people are cowards. Keep your fucking opinions to yourself. If you are threatening violence on anyone online, yeah, you should be investigated. But people still have the right to vent and be angry at a system that they perceive as not caring. Yeah, you can't make threats against certain people, because there's probably a lot of people in America that are making threats against Trump. But that's a perfect example of what we don't want to happen here in Australia. We don't want the normalisation of political violence, because it seems that it has become too familiar in American politics, and it's always been there. It goes right back to Lincoln, and I think even before him. So that's nothing new in the American political system. In Australia, it's a bit different. We don't have a president, we have a prime minister. And for the most part, Australian politics has been pretty boring until probably the last 10 years. And it seems like people are just more angry and frustrated with the leaders because they are so ideologically captured, or they're corrupt, or they're being brought and paid for by big business, corporations, and lobbying groups. And it doesn't seem like the leaders we vote for are the same leaders we are getting. And going back to what I was saying about promotion of communal violence, I think we can all agree that no one wants or should support that. And that sounds all well and good on the surface, but what happens if you have a social media page, Instagram for example, you make a clip about something, a reel or a short about a political event or topic, someone comments something pretty hateful, who says, this is hypothetical too, so ASIO, don't come and arrest me. What if someone says we need to march on the Capitol and burn down the establishment or something like that? For example, once again, ASIO, that's an example. Does that content creator get dragged into the promotion of communal violence because it is their page? And I did hear that recently somewhere too. If you have a page and someone does make a hateful or an extremist or radical comment, you could be liable for that comment on your page, even if you didn't make it, or even if you didn't even fucking read it. Some of these huge content creators get thousands of comments. How do they have time to go through them all? Yet they could potentially be dragged into quote-unquote promotion of communal violence. And that is very concerning to me. One, that creator may not even know about the comment or support that view. The blame has to land on the person who made it. And changing those laws, does that include that? So does that content creator get dragged into this investigation? Who made a comment on their page? Now, was this comment made in anger? Did they retract their words later on? Did they delete the comment? Does ASIO even care about that? Or if you make a stupid comment on someone's social media page, are you just automatically tarred and feathered with this quote-unquote extremist or terrorist ideology brush? And that's what is very concerning. Where did the powers actually stop? And I could go on and on about this all day, but one final thing I'll say about communal violence is, in the past couple of years, it doesn't really seem like ASIO has done their job well enough. I mean, if this was true, Bondi wouldn't have happened. Yeah, they've come out and they've made excuses, but I don't buy anything that they fucking say. So they want more power, but what do they actually do with the power that they already have? Because you can't tell me those two fuckwits went overseas to a place in the Philippines that just happened to have one of the highest rates of terrorist training camps and Islamic terrorist groups, You can't tell me they just went to a hotel for a couple of weeks and didn't leave the hotel room and they were radicalized by the fucking wallpaper. You cannot fucking say with a straight face to the Australian people that that's what happened and they returned to Australia and then no red flags were raised. Because I don't fucking buy it, and neither do millions of other people. And yet this is the same agency that has failed several times to prevent acts of violence in this country, but wants more powers to quote-unquote stop these acts of violence, espionage, sabotage, politically motivated violence, communal violence, etc. Yet they have such a bad track record. So why should they be given even more powers to crack down on personal and democratic freedoms even further if they could barely do the job beforehand when some of these powers were already in place? The boss of ASIO, I can't remember that woman's name, but some of the things she says are absolutely fucking ridiculous. We have a team of flying hate disruptors. They're obsessed with the quote-unquote hate and hate speech. The two guys that shot up Bondi were both on the ASIO watch list. Well, I know the son was. I don't know so much about the father, but the son was on the ASIO watch list. He was on the ASIO watch list and was deemed not a big enough threat to keep him there. They go overseas to the Philippines, check into a hotel in an area that is known to be a terrorist hotspot, and we're supposed to believe they just stayed in the hotel room for 3 or 4 weeks. So a father and son just go overseas, don't leave the hotel room. I mean, what the fuck were they doing? Were they just jerking each other off for fucking 3 or 4 weeks? Watching soap operas and staring out the windows? I fucking highly doubt it. And I do not believe that for a second there isn't something more to it and that ASIO didn't know about it. So either ASIO is grossly incompetent or underfunded or whatever it happens to be, under-resourced, because they essentially let Bondi happen through complacency and bad decision-making. The son should never have been taken off of a watch list. And what came to light after Bondi is the son had gone to the Diwali Centre in Western Sydney and been in the vicinity of some pretty radical extremist figures that were well known to the authorities, which I went into in detail on Bondi IA Part 2. If you've listened to this show for any amount of time, you'll know I like to be fair and balanced. I don't like to look at just one perspective, because that would be ignorant. So let's have a look at the counterpoint, or the government frame. This is how the government and ASIO are framing the proposed new changes. The government and ASIO claim that these powers are preventative, not punitive. They are used rarely and not only under warrant. Intelligence agencies require tools to act before harm occurs. ASIO publicly describes its role as identifying and disrupting threats before they materialize into violence. Once again, I'll come back to Bondi. They failed epically. Now, maybe that was just like a one-off thing. Maybe they were under-resourced or funded, whatever it happened to be, but they failed. The guy was on the watch list. They knew they had gone overseas, but that doesn't seem to have raised enough red flags. So I'm not convinced ASIO can do a better job with more powers. And they're preventative, not punitive. Now, I'm pretty sure ASIO already has enough preventative laws and measures in place to stop violence from occurring. I mean, intelligence agencies require tools to act before harm occurs. How many fucking more tools can these agencies possibly need? You think with all the technological advances they would have enough, but apparently it's not, and yet threats still occur. Threats aren't going away. So it doesn't seem like it's a question of resources and tools. It seems like, I don't know, maybe they need a new system. Maybe they need to do things differently. Yeah, that breaches the democratic rights of people living in a democracy, because you essentially have to spy on the population. So that brings up the whole moral and philosophical question about government surveillance. And what does it say about the government if it can't trust its own people? Yeah, I know security, you have to look into these things, but that comes at the cost of violating the public trust and violating people's privacy and physical sovereignty. And essentially that's kind of what the Patriot Act did in the United States, and it hasn't really made the world safer. It's made it more chaotic and more of a basket case. It hasn't really stopped many things from happening. It seemed like it was more control mechanisms for control's sake. And I'm concerned that a similar thing is going to happen with Bill No. 2. And yeah, they can say they rarely use them, but that doesn't mean if they extend these powers that they won't use them more. because apparently the threat situation has increased over time, not decreased. And if the post 9/11 world is anything to go by, that threat level is probably going to keep increasing in the future because there's going to be more threats, cyber threats, yada, yada, yada. And then agencies like ASIO will claim they need more tools and more funding to keep people safe. But yet you couldn't keep people safe in December of 2025. The other concerning thing is they've gotten rid of the sunset clause, which means they want to keep these powers for as long as they can. And going back to when the first bill was enacted in 2003, they didn't really go away. They came about in 2003 and they've lasted all the way to 2026. And they're proposing this new extension and getting rid of the sunset clauses. So how long was the sunset clause? And that was brought in, I'm pretty sure, with the Act of 1979. So how long did that go? Did they go from 79 to 2005? Or did it go to 2003 or 2000 and it was dug up and then changed post 9/11? And that's concerning. I mean, they could extend these powers for the next 100 years if they wanted to. And where do you draw the line? If the threat level comes down, do they get rid of these powers? Maybe that's a clause they can look at. If the threat level goes up, then maybe they talk about bringing in extensions to these powers, but there has to be sunset clauses and revision dates placed on all of them. Otherwise, this could get really out of hand. And speaking of 9/11, let's go back in time once again and have a look at where these bills originated and why they were introduced in the first place. The temporary state. ASIO has had compulsory questioning powers since the early 2000s, introduced after 9/11. These powers allow the organisation under warrant to compel a person to appear before a prescribed authority, answer questions, provide information relevant to national security intelligence. Under the ASIO Act, a warrant may be issued where there are reasonable grounds for believing the questioning will substantially assist the collection of intelligence important in relation to a security matter. I guess the big question I have regarding that statement is if ASIO's had these powers since the early 2000s, why didn't they question or detain the two Bondi shooters? I guess the big reason why they didn't was probably because they needed a warrant. And in Amendment Bill 2, they want to take away that warrant and be able to question anybody to quote-unquote keep everybody safe. I'm sure if they presented their evidence to a judge, they could have got a search warrant to search the father's premises and found that he was in possession of a lot of firearms, even though they were legal. Questions probably should still have been asked. The father, you can maybe say, yeah, he was part of a shooting club, he had the licenses, yada, 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 but the son, I think, is inexcusable. He was previously on an ASIO watch list, and maybe this comes down to an issue with the judges. These are the same judges that don't want to put pedophiles or real criminals in jail for more than 6 weeks, but they'll lock someone up for a year for saying a prohibited slogan at a protest. Maybe it's a question the judges are being too lenient. However, as I just mentioned, the son was already on a ASIO watch list. So by default, he was already under surveillance for links to extremism or terrorism. And we know he went to the same mosque as that hate preacher. We know he attended there, so why wasn't that brought to a judgment? I don't know, maybe it was. But it seems like that should be enough evidence to maybe search this guy's premises, maybe confiscate his devices and find out who he's been talking to, because that sounds like that's what the laws were intended to do all along. Now they want to get rid of the warrant part and just question anyone they believe to be suspicious or might have information relevant to national security, yada, 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 however they want to justify it. As I just mentioned, the compulsory questioning powers under ASIO can get someone to appear before a prescribed authority, answer questions, and provide information relevant to national security intelligence. So what does that mean? It more or less means intelligence is relevant and it's not a criminal suspicion or a criminal charge. This is a key structural distinction between intelligence law and criminal law. If you get asked to appear before an authority or you get dragged in for questioning, it's not criminal suspicion and you don't automatically get charged under a criminal act. By the sounds of it, it seems like the reason for the questioning is intelligence related only or relevant to intelligence purposes and not criminal. So let's have a look at the other side of this opinion. What is the counterpoint? So the government's position on this, they argue intelligence agencies operate in prevention space. Waiting for criminal thresholds may be too late. Okay, that's a valid argument. Coercive questioning is strictly controlled and warrant-based. They emphasise an Attorney General approval is required. Oversight exists via IGIS and the Parliament. The last one is the most concerning statement and counterpoint by the government. Coercive questioning is strictly controlled. I doubt in real life that would actually play out like they think it does, because as we all know, nothing in real life works the same way it does in theory. If that was the case, there would be no police or intelligence agency misconduct. And there is. In other words, ASIO can just pretty much talk you into anything. As of late 2025, early 2026, a number of Australian states have introduced new coercive control laws to protect women and children in domestic violence situations from former or current partners. Now, that legislation changed to protect people from being the victim of violent crime, because coercion usually does lead to something worse. And yes, it is a different set of circumstances to a degree, but if the individual states view coercive control and coercion as being criminal or a criminal act, why does ASIO have the right to coercive questioning? In other words, they can try to talk you into giving up any type of information or admitting to anything, even if it's not based on fact. In other words, it's bullying by a security agency. And if the cops did that, there would be a malpractice case that would go through the courts and the cop would probably be fired. Because this has happened in the past. The police have talked people into admitting to crimes that they didn't commit because they think they fit the narrative profile of the suspect. Now, I'm not saying that has happened recently. That has happened in the past, and the police have gotten hot water because of it. And ASIO want powers to coercively question people, even if it's strictly controlled. I don't see how getting somebody to admit something under false pretenses, even if it is strictly controlled, is worth shit. Because if that went through the courts, how can a judge take that testimony seriously if it is based on a lie? And if they do take it seriously, then that brings up bigger questions about the whole foundation of the legal system in this country. If ASIO can just bully you into answering any type of questions, and that goes to court, if ASIO are the ones that got a suspect to admit to, whatever it is you're accused of doing, even if it's based under false pretenses and the judge signs off on it just because ASIO has given it its rubber stamp of approval, that should be very concerning, because that means the whole legal foundation is not really built on truth and justice. It's whatever the powers that be decide the truth is. The other concerning thing I can see happening is if you are labelled as a terror suspect, then your human rights kind of go right out the window. I think if a system like this is to be brought in, there needs to be a hell of a lot more oversight and fail-safes, because this has the potential to go very sideways very quick. The IGIS is the oversight body. So they're the ones that would be supervising the coercion. And the IGS is the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. So they are connected to the security apparatus, so I'm not sure that supervision would quite benefit the person being questioned. I think maybe a independent state-to-state local body would probably be more beneficial. So I went to their website to find out what they're all about. So on the first page of the website, under what we do, the IGS is described as: we provide independent assurance to ministers, parliament and the public as to whether Australia's intelligence and security agencies within our jurisdiction are acting with legality, propriety and consistency within human rights. We do this by conducting inquiries, undertaking regular and proactive inspections, and investigating complaints and public interest disclosures that are made to us by members of the public or current or former intelligence officials. Okay, so they're an oversight committee. Sounds good on paper, but in reality, how does it work? Because I don't think I trust any institution, government or private anymore, because I've been let down personally by these systems for so long. I was someone who was caught up in robo-debt, as I've mentioned before. That was a government program that was put into place by the Liberal government. The government washed its hand of it of it and blamed everybody who got a bullshit notice that they owed money to a government department. So from a personal standpoint, how can I trust anything the government ever says again? I've been let down by them, and with the current Albanese government, they've gone back on their election promises. They promised not to get rid of negative gearing or the capital gains tax, and they did. They've also brought in new hate speech laws and have pretty much effectively destroyed free speech in this country. So how can I trust anything that comes out of a government department's mouth, because they continually fucking lie? So on paper, this sounds great, and yes, the consistency with human rights, but where does that end? If you have a real hardcore terror suspect and ASIO thinks this is the guy, can they get the IGIS on board? To, I don't know, not so much look the other way, but maybe if this person really is a terrorist, do their human rights go out the window for the sake of the case or the argument? Or quote unquote for stopping future violence? Where do you draw the line? Because I can see some very murky territory ahead. So Bill number 1 is not the controversial reform. It extends existing compulsory questioning powers until March 2027, ensuring continuity while broader reforms are considered. And those new reforms are Amendment Bill number 2. So I have another counterpoint for that argument, and this comes from the civil liberties perspective. The Law Council of Australia has warned that repeated extensions of extraordinary powers risk normalising emergency measures originally intended to be temporary. And I think that is a very key point. They were brought in with the pretext of 9/11, and they haven't really gone away. They've been extended, and now that extension is coming to an end, and now they're talking about extending them even further. So where did the fuck do you draw the line? Because if you're going to keep extending them, you might as well just make them permanent and never be able to be changed. Because that more or less sounds like that is the plan for ASIO. They just want these powers to continually go and go and go and go and never be taken away, because there's always a threat and there's always this notion of preventing future espionage, terrorism, extremism, whatever it happens to be. And if the Law Council of Australia is speaking up about civil liberties and how that can be violated, I think we really need to be paying attention. The other thing that is concerning too is the government has pretty much tried to hide this from the public. Like, we weren't asked about it. We weren't asked to vote on it. This is another major reforms bill that's being pushed through Parliament without really the knowledge of the general public. Then going back to the budget, why wasn't the general public consulted or given the right to vote to remove the capital gains tax or negative gearing? If a government decision is going to have this big of an effect on the Australian people, we should be required to vote on it. Because it kind of sounds like we're playing this rigged system, because the government can just bring anything in, say, fuck the Australian people, and we can just live with it. And so far, the budget has gone down like a lead balloon, and the government will probably have to reverse its decision about negative gearing and capital gains, because it has been catastrophically unpopular for Albanese's government. And he's about as popular as a nun in a whorehouse. His approval rating is the lowest I've seen it in a very long time. And if there was an election tomorrow, he would be packing his fucking bags and leaving before Monday. So this brings us down to the bill in question, Bill number 2. Bill number 2 proposes, number 1, a removal of sunset clauses. And if you don't know, a sunset clause is basically a legal safeguard requiring Parliament to revisit laws after a fixed period. And I think if a bill that is so vague and so Orwellian, such as Bill 2, is to be brought in, there needs to be some type of revisit period clause locked into it. They can't just take off the fucking sunset clause and just let it go for eternity. It needs to be revised to make sure it's working, and more importantly, make sure it's working properly. And if people have been caught up in it, are their human rights and their civil liberties and their personal rights being upheld by these security agencies? Because it sounds like they want all the limits taken off of it, so ASIO can just question whoever they want under the pretext of preventing future crime, because we're kind of going into Minority Report territory there. I don't see how it's a good idea to just open the floodgates on a bill like this, and then that means other bills will be proposed and they'll want the safeguards taken off. It seems like a recipe for disaster. I think any decision and law that's brought into effect that is so controversial and divisive that can affect so many people, especially one that straddles the line between preventative national security and Orwellian authoritarianism, needs to be looked at and revised regularly, like every fucking year. It has all the hallmarks of a dystopian sci-fi film written all over it. And unfortunately, that's probably what the future of this country is going to look like, because both sides of politics want to bring this in and there's not a lot of opposition. The same way the hate speech laws were brought in with pretty much no opposition, despite one party saying they were going to oppose them and then doing this 11th hour backflip. So without the sunset clause, there is no automatic expiry, no mandatory review trigger, and powers remain unless they are actively repealed, which probably won't happen. Number 2, expansion of security grounds. This includes sabotage, foreign interference, politically motivated violence, communal violence, and infrastructure threats. So not too dissimilar to what we've already seen in the previous bill. So what is the government counterpoint to this? So the government's justification is that the threat environment is permanently complex. Well, the threat environment has always been permanently complex. That doesn't mean you get to walk on civil liberties and crush democracy in the process. The other argument is hybrid warfare and cyber operations require broad definitions. Do they? Cyber operations, hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is not a new term, it's been around for a while. Now, I will say, from a corporate point of view, cybersecurity in Australia is piss poor. There's been multiple cybersecurity breaches with some of Australia's biggest companies. Companies that you would think would have state-of-the-art security. These companies make billions of dollars a year, and apparently they have security systems that an amateur hacker could get through in about 20 minutes. The most high profile of these was the Optus data breach, which I was also caught up in. So you can kind of see where I'm getting my trust issues from, because I've had government and corporate entities in this country fuck myself over. One targeted my money and the other targeted my personal information. So you can see where I'm getting these trust issues from. And I'm probably not the only one. There's probably millions of people out there that are thinking exactly the same thing. I don't like the statement either that cyber operations require broad definitions. By that definition, everything is a broad definition, because, yeah, cyber operations are broad, but what do you actually mean? Is this a counter cyber attack? Is it surveillance? What are you actually talking about? And I guess it is a broad definition, but I don't think a broad definition can justify such over-the-top security measures, especially if you have trouble defining cyber operations and hybrid warfare. Or maybe that didn't make any fucking sense. And the final point is legislative permanence reflects operational reality. And I take that to mean that they basically want these powers to not have an expiry date, because the operational reality of modern security and surveillance is complex, as they've outlined, and there is no defined definition of hybrid warfare, cyber operations. You don't really know where the threat's coming from. They need as many ongoing powers as possible in order to do their job effectively and, quote unquote, keep people safe. And that is the modern operational reality of running a security agency, more or less. Maybe I missed something, probably did, but to me that's what it reads like on the surface. And I guess that last point is particularly true. Yes, we do live in a modern time with a changing threat environment, foreign interference, cyber warfare, hacking, it's a real thing. Foreign governments do launch cyber attacks, especially in Australia and America and places like that. Foreign state actors launch cyber attacks on behalf of a nation, however the government defines that. So that could be a legitimate point for this new legislation. Foreign interference is definitely becoming a daily occurrence and a major threat to national security. I'm just not sure how taking it out on the Australian people prevents or stops that, unless you're like a foreigner in Australia in some high-paying job and you're actually a spy. But I think those people should probably be a bit more obvious. But then again, there was a Australian Defence Force ad on the TV a couple of years ago, and there was a a Russian woman, and I think her husband or something in the ad. She was in the Army Reserve, and apparently she had been a Russian spy for about 20-something years, and the Defence Force had no idea. So, go figure. Maybe ASIO is just as grossly incompetent as people say. Who knows? Bill 2 also expands interpretive scope into broader destabilisation categories. The counterpoint to that argument is from the critics' point of view. Critics argue broad definitions increase interpretive flexibility, and I'm inclined to agree with that. If you can't accurately define something, then I guess anything can fit the definition depending on which way you want to point the magnifying glass. Any law, any person, any situation could be defined as potential terrorism, for example, if the definition is too broad. And I think from the ASIO point of view, it sounds like they want a broad definition so they can look at everything and everyone under the one light to see if there's anything there. And why that's great from a security point of view to have that unrestricted power, in reality, that is a breach of civil liberties. Because if you can't accurately define what something is or isn't, then we live in a very ambiguous state where anything can be interpreted as anything or anyone. And just recently in Australia, I can't actually believe this happened, but I guess I can because it's 2026 in Australia and it's this weird Twilight Zone-esque era to be living in. A biological man who identifies as a woman sued a real biological woman who owned an app that was intended to be used by women only. It was a women's communication app. I can't remember the name of it. The individual who sued the app developer was kicked off the platform for not being a biological woman. This went to court last week, and the guy actually won. So we're living in a time period where the Australian government can't even define what a woman is. So that doesn't give me any hope that ASIO, a government department, a government-funded security apparatus, is going to be able to define jack fucking shit. How do they define what an extremist or a terrorist is? That could be fucking anybody. It just depends on how hard they want to look. Because if the fucking court of Australia can't determine what a real fucking woman is, how do they determine what a real terrorist is? And I 100% agree with critics. Broad definitions increase interpretive flexibility because the government has just literally been flexible with biological gender. They can't even agree on the definition of a living human woman, let alone a broad category of definitions relating to security, cybersecurity, national security, terrorism, extremism. If the court systems, I don't know, that's not connected to the government, if they can't agree with something we all know to be true, how do we trust an organization that uses broad definitions to go about its business and to investigate people? Because broad definitions don't lead anywhere good. And going back to communism, they use broad definitions to describe their enemies and any opposition to Bolshevik political power. The Bolsheviks led to the rise of the Soviet Party. The Soviet Party turned into the Soviet Union. The Soviet government used very broad definitions to, one, accuse individuals of crimes against the state or the party and lock them up and throw away the key, or they just killed you. And let's not forget, a lot of people died because they made a comment against the supreme leader, Joseph Stalin, or they said something that went against either the Soviets or the Bolsheviks, or they weren't part of the Soviet Party or the Bolshevik Party. They were the White Army, therefore they were the enemy, and you could do whatever you wanted to them. When the Australian government starts throwing around phrases like racist, nationalist, supremacist, my alarm bells start to ring because they are trying to label people and put them into designated categories to make them much easier to target, question, and detain later on. That's a very extreme example where this can go, but it has happened before in history, and let's not forget that. Albanese has been very liberal in his use of the terms nationalist, specifically that word nationalist. He's been using that word a lot lately. So anyone who is deemed a nationalist is an enemy to the goals of the Labor Party and their ideology. if things go completely tits up in this country. Now, hypothetically, could a Prime Minister in future years give ASIO orders and say, we need to start looking into these nationalists. They're the ones that are causing the problems, and that's where the biggest threat of terrorism or violence is going to come from. So let's investigate them before something happens. Now, all of a sudden, ASIO starts targeting anybody who has been labelled nationalist or put on a quote-unquote nationalist watch list. Is that the type of future we really want? And I know that's worst-case scenario, but that has happened in history. That's happened with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The Nazis did that. The Soviets, communists, Maoists, they've all done it. All these totalitarian regimes have started with similar ideas, and it's progressed, and it's got to a point where there's fields full of mass graves, or there's mega prisons being built, and people are being locked up in the gulags left, right, and centre for criticising the supreme leader. Look at North Korea. You say anything bad about fucking Kim Jong-un and you get fed to the fucking dogs. Stalin was the same. You question Stalin, you got 5-6 years in the gulag. Just ask Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He criticised the government and got, 5 years in the gulag, which led him to write his epic Gulag Archipelago. And I know what I just outlined was a very over-dramatic, extreme example, but this type of thing has happened in history before, and let's not forget it. Critics also argue intelligence categories can expand over time, and that's another red flag for me, because it sounds like the security services can just change the goalpost at any time. That's another very broad definition. And what does that mean in reality? Does that mean only members of banned groups get looked into one day? Fast forward a few years and then all of a sudden the intelligence categories get extended to podcasters and authors, people who have a Substack or a blog. Now all those people start getting looked at. Is that where we want to go? Because that kind of sounds like that's what could happen. If intelligence categories can expand over time, then nothing's off the table. The final counterpoint is mission creep becomes structurally possible. So what is the government's response to the critics? The government says that Parliament must approve any legal change. Once again, I don't have a lot of faith in there being any type of constructive counter or opposition in Parliament, because it seems like both parties, the Liberal and the Labor Party, are two sides of the same coin. And if the hate speech laws are anything to go by, Labor didn't really have any opposition, despite the Liberal Party claiming it was going to oppose that decision because it was in the best interest of the Australian people. Like I said a couple of times, I did this 11th hour backflip, and the rest is history. No one apologised, no one cared. The government also says definitions are still legislated, not discretionary. Remains to be seen. And this brings us to speech, hate laws and overlap concerns. Australia has strengthened hate speech and online harm laws in parallel with security reforms. These are separate legal systems, but critics argue they form a broader governance environment focused on harmful speech, radicalisation pathways, and influence operations. Once again, they are all very, very broad definitions and terms. What is harmful speech? What is harmful for someone might not be harmful to someone else. What is a radicalisation pathway? Could podcasts and podcasters be classed as radicalisation pathways in the future? What is the definition of an influence operation? Once again, a YouTube channel or a podcast, could that be influence? Could literally a social media influencer be a radicalisation influencer too? Where the fuck do you draw the line? Because it sounds like they want to control every little part of the internet and free speech, because there might be a security threat somewhere in there. And the way I liken this is, just because someone is pissing in one end of the pool doesn't mean you're going to get a face full of it at the opposite end. There's a lot of water to dilate that piss before it reaches you. And I think in social media, it's kind of the same way. Everyone thinks anytime someone makes a comment or a fucking post, bang, there's another 10,000 radicalized young people. I don't think young people are that fucking stupid. I think they get negatively tarred with this. Well, they're so impressionable. Their brains aren't developed to brush. They can't make up their own fucking minds and work out what is right and what is wrong. I don't think young people are that fucking stupid. they already figured out how to get around the social media ban, and they know who was lying to them. And I think that is the big issue in all of this, is the government is losing control of the young people. And I think that is the big issue in all this. The government knows it's losing the support of young people and their future voting base. They realize that young people are too fucking smart to believe their bullshit. They don't believe the same shit their parents and their parents' believed, because they have access to alternative voices and opinions, and the government is scared shitless of that. They want to silence these alternative opinions and voices before they reach the young people and future voters. They don't want a counter-narrative being pushed that contradicts their own. And I think that brings up a bigger problem. The governments worldwide will never admit they're wrong. They'll never admit when they've lied. And they keep making the same mistakes, and the younger generation is just not buying it. I don't buy it. I never have brought it. So if I don't buy it, then the generation after me and the generation after that is not going to buy it either. And that is the major problem, is governments lie and they're not willing to come out to the Australian people and say, look, we fucked up. Please accept our apologies, but this is what we have to do. And Albanese had the chance to do that a couple of weeks ago Albanese had the chance to do that last week with the budget. He's been getting grilled by mainstream media, which I didn't think was going to happen, but it was amusing to see. Every interview I saw on mainstream media of him, the host of these morning shows would ask him the same question. Did you go back on your word? Did you lie to the Australian people? You said this in your campaign promises, that you weren't going to get rid of negative gearing and you weren't going to touch the capital gains tax. They played clips of him saying this over and over again from different sources. There was a collage of him saying, we will not touch the capital gains tax, yada, yada, yada. And they did. They got rid of it. And when he was pushed on these points, he didn't have a good answer. He just clammed up and started lying. He said, no, that was a statement. That was a statement said back then. That's still a fucking lie, whatever way you want to look at it. You lied to the Australian people and you went back on your word. Now, if you had to come out and said, yes, look, we did say that, but unfortunately times have changed, blame it on the fucking oil crisis. Blame it on Trump. That would have been half believable, and it would have kept a little bit of his integrity intact. But these fucking narcissistic, psychopathic fucking prime ministers and presidents do not give a fuck. They think everyone is dumb as shit and we just deserve to be fucking ruled. Like, he is so much smarter than the average person. In recent months, Albanese has really shown his true colours. He's shown the Australian people that he is just a horrible, narcissistic little man with an axe to grind against the Australian people and anyone who had it better than him when he was growing up. But the fact that he couldn't even come up with a half credible lie, like I said, if he had to come out on television and said, look, times have changed due to the war in Iran and the inflation rate and due to the rapidly changing nature of the planet, we have had to do this. It's unfortunate, but it might work and help us get out of some debt. That would have tracked with the Australian people a lot better than the shit that came pouring out of his mouth. It's like the politicians just enjoy pissing people off. I don't know why his scriptwriters didn't give him that prompt, because it would have created some type of unity, like we're all in this together. Yes, times are tough, but we can all get through it if we just make some sacrifices now. If he had said that, I think most people probably would have gotten on board or been far less critical of him, but he didn't. He doubled down on his bullshit and refused to admit he said or did anything wrong, despite the overwhelming evidence supporting that he did in fact go back on his word. And this is the same government that wants to bring these new laws in and give ASIO, the same agency that dropped the ball with the Bondi massacre, even more powers to potentially drop further balls in the future. Don't have a lot of fucking faith this is going to lead anywhere good. It's also the same Prime Minister that I am convinced wants to ban social media and podcasts because he doesn't like what people say about him. Now, maybe if he looked more inwards and maybe thought more internally about his own actions and why people don't trust him, he might be a bit more sympathetic to the Australian people. Now, the legal counterpoint to this is ASIO does not regulate speech. Hate speech laws regulate harm, not opinion. Political communication remains constitutionally protected. Yes, while that last one might be true for now, there are things you can't report on. There's things you can't say. I wouldn't even feel comfortable saying some of these things or reporting on some of these things in a constitutionally protected political sense, because everything is so broad and loose. All these agencies want more power. The Prime Minister's a pathological liar and goes back on his word, so I'm not convinced any of this would be protected or guaranteed in the future. Hate speech laws apparently regulate harm, not opinion, but you can't express your opinion even if it is ignorant, even if it is quote-unquote hateful. You might not think it's hateful, but it might be hateful for someone. The hate speech laws are very interpretive, and that is the problem. Like, if you can't define what a woman is, and you can't define what constitutes as hate speech, and you can't define what new security threats accurately, how the fuck can you define or regulate anything? If you cannot define logic, you can't define anything. Everything is fucking mental illness and bullshit at that point. If you can't define the definition of a man and a woman, how are you going to define something as complex as hate speech or present or future security threats? ASIO does not regulate speech. No, they don't, but they do enforce it if the government demands it. Because ASIO is kicking your door in if you get labelled a fucking terrorist or an anti-Semite or a racist or a nationalist or whatever other is out there. Hate speech laws regulate harm, not opinion, but you can't express your opinion in most cases if it is determined to be hateful, even if that wasn't the intent. Because from memory, I think the biggest controversy regarding the hate speech laws was the way they were interpreted or something like that. It wasn't what was intended, it was how it was interpreted. Because these laws originally started off as hate speech and then they kind of morphed into fear speech. Because the government said they were getting rid of hate speech, then they ended up replacing the hate speech with the fear speech. And it wasn't the intention of what it was said, it was how it was interpreted. So if it was interpreted or if it caused fear to someone, that was enough to get charged. Where hate speech, I think, was a little more lenient. You had to target a specific group or an individual or something like that. Once again, I should be able to remember this. But the fear speech was even more broad and even less defined than the hate speech, which therefore makes the laws even more vague and the chances of you getting caught up in it even greater. And there's already been a couple of cases of these new laws being put into effect. One of them happened earlier this year. It was in Sydney. I think most of the laws have been in Sydney because they've been the most heavy-handed with enforcing them. Now, this brings up the question of prevention logic. Modern intelligence law is preventative. Detect early risks, map networks, intervene before violence occurs. And this differs from criminal law, which requires proof after an offence has been committed. And that's kind of the Minority Report question. You can't arrest someone for murder before they've actually committed a murder. Because in our current code of criminal law, that person is innocent until proven guilty. Where the intelligence law is kind of a bit precoggy. It's preventative, and obviously you can't let a mass casualty event happen if you can stop it. And a lot of time involving terrorism, there's a lot of build-up around these networks. And there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of communications and a lot of planning that takes place before an event actually happens, because there's a lot of moving parts to it, which gives the authorities time to gather evidence and act before an act of violence occurs. The counterpoint to this, some supporters argue that prevention is necessary because modern threats evolve too quickly for reactive enforcement. Yeah, there's an argument for that. A lot of terrorist groups don't use modern technology. They're a bit too savvy for that. They'll use direct person-to-person messages in the form of couriers. It takes time to monitor and surveil a courier's pattern. It can also be very hard to gather any type of intelligence, so that is a legitimate argument. But critics, on the other hand, argue that prevention relies on interpretation, not established criminal evidence. That's a valid argument as well. I guess the difference between a criminal act and an act of terrorism is there's a large amount of ideology at play. This idea you're doing something for the greater good. Terrorism obviously aims for mass destruction to get the point across, where criminals are usually isolated to a community. So I guess, yeah, there is that argument to be made that terrorism is more destructive, it does have more moving parts, and can be harder to stop. Where I guess a criminal at some point is probably going to get caught depending on what type of crime it is. Like the alcohol and fire bombings that have been happening in Victoria, those guys are going to get caught eventually because it's just too messy, it's too sloppy, the pattern's too obvious. This has only been happening for the last couple of months at time of recording. They're using teenagers to commit the arson attacks. They're getting picked up by the cops and they're just giving all this information over to the police because they don't want to get charged with anything. And obviously they're getting bailed because they're not old enough to go to jail. The criminals are using the teenagers to keep their hands clean, but at the same time the teenagers are implementing this larger criminal network and the police are already picking up the pattern. So given what we know now about Amendment Bill No. 2, how it works, why it's been proposed and what it could potentially lead to, I started thinking of scenarios where this could go wrong. How could the everyday person get caught up in a system like this? So I came up with 2 mock scenarios where this could go really, really wrong. And these are extreme cases. I'm putting this mock hypothetical scenario out there because this could realistically happen if these laws do get passed. And I have a feeling that this is what life could be like in Australia if Amendment Bill 2 passes. Mock scenario 1, the student researcher. A university student conducts academic research into extremist ideology. The student analyzes propaganda, studies online radicalization, and maps ideological narratives. A related investigation later identifies one forum as linked to a violent extremist actor. The student is not charged, is not suspected of wrongdoing, but is believed to hold quote-unquote relevant intelligence. A compulsory question warrant is issued for the student. So this student is thinking, what the fuck did I do wrong? I'm just researching this for uni. Why am I being caught up in a terrorism case? Why am I being called to answer questions by ASIO? The student now finds himself in a difficult position because now they've been called to attend questioning where they are required to answer questions and comply under penalty of law. And this falls under intelligence relevance threshold under the ASIO Act framework. So that could happen to a student, potentially, if they talked to an extremist. Maybe they interviewed someone with extremist ideologies or terrorist sympathies, or maybe even a terrorist or an extremist themselves as part of a university assignment. They potentially could be brought in for questioning under this new ASIO bill, which is kind of fucking scary. The next scenario is one that is close to home and a few people I know can probably relate to. This is mock scenario number 2, the podcaster. A political podcast covers extremism, geopolitical conflict, controversial ideological movements. A listener later becomes involved in extremist activity. Investigators assess whether the podcaster, quote, has relevant communications, is connected to investigative networks, or holds intelligence relevant to broader inquiry. So now this podcaster is being questioned by ASIO. The podcaster is not charged or accused with anything, not alleged to have facilitated violence in any way, but may be compelled to provide information under warrant. And if they don't comply, you can get, I think, up to 5 years in jail. That puts the podcaster and student in a very difficult position. And as I outlined at the start of the show, if this podcaster has a large following online, what if this extremist comments on one of their reels or one of their posts? Does that podcaster become of interest to ASIO? And it sounds like that could actually happen. Now, what if the podcaster interviews an extremist or someone with terrorist ideologies because they want to find out more? They don't necessarily agree with it or support it. They're doing this from a curiosity standpoint or a way to spread awareness about where ideology can lead, such as ending up as a terrorist or an extremist somewhere. And plenty of mainstream media outlets have interviewed nefarious people before. One of the American news channels in the 90s interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer. People have interviewed known terrorists who have been convicted of terrorism and killing people. Does that mean news and current affairs programs will also be brought in for questioning under these new laws? I don't think so. I don't think the news media will be touched, or some current affairs programs, because there's a legitimate argument in that they've interviewed terrorists or whatever, and they have information that could be relevant to the quote-unquote intelligence or security. Now, will it be a case of double standard for legacy media versus new media? I don't know. I guess only time will tell. The counterpoint to this argument from the government position is intelligence relevance does not imply wrongdoing. Questioning is investigative, not accusatory. However, critics do argue proximity to investigations can trigger compulsory state involvement. And this brings up the bigger question. Could these laws be applied to anyone? A warrant must be approved by the Attorney General. It must be justified as likely to substantially assist the collection of intelligence important to security. But no criminal charge is required and no suspicion of offence is required. Only intelligence relevance. And that is the real broad term in all of this. You don't have to have a criminal charge and you don't have to be under suspicion of any offence. You can just be brought in for questioning under the quote-unquote intelligence relevance, which could literally be anybody. But at the same time, it does sound like the Attorney General must issue a warrant for someone to be investigated. But then that opens up a whole new line of questioning. How lenient is the Attorney General? Is the Attorney General just going to sign off a warrant for anybody? Or is there some type of minimum amount of evidence ASIO needs to present to the Attorney General before they look into an individual or a group? The government position is strict warrant processes ensure safeguards. I'm not sure I 100% believe that. As we've seen plenty of times, safeguards aren't always what they've turned out to be. Oversight bodies monitor misissue. Not sure I 100% believe that. Powers are rarely used and tightly controlled. Then why go to all the trouble in the first place? Why go to all the trouble to add new laws and get rid of the sunset clause? If these powers are rarely used and tightly controlled, why not just keep the current ones in place and just bring them into effect whenever someone is accused or under the suspicion of terrorism or extremism or whatever it happens to be? Why go to all the trouble to amend the bills in the first place? What has the Australian government said about Amendment Bill 2? Because so far I have heard fuck all from any side of politics talk about it. I've not heard it mentioned once by anyone in politics. I haven't seen it on the news. And it seems like they're deliberately keeping it quiet. Now, while there is no direct quotes from anyone from either side of government messaging consistently states that intelligence agencies must have, quote, the tools and powers necessary to keep Australians safe. Well, I thought they already fucking did. So this did get me thinking, so I did look it up. So according to the current 2025-2026 budget estimates, ASIO funding is roughly $1 to $1.1 billion a year. Apparently, it's tiny compared to the Australian Defence Force and wider defence portfolio. So maybe there is a legitimate reason why ASIO wants more funding. Defence spending is roughly 51 to 67 billion, depending on whether you count just core defence or the entire defence portfolio, including agencies and programs. In practical terms, defence gets around 50 to 60 times more funding than ASIO. ASIO is a major intelligence agency, but it is still relatively small compared to military spending, health, welfare, or the NDIS. To give perspectives against the other big federal spending areas in 25 to 26, defence gets about 51 to 55 billion, NDIS gets about 50 billion. That is fucking outrageous. How does the NDIS get as much money as the fucking Defence Force? The NDIS has been exposed in recent months about how corrupt it is and how easy it is to basically get free money from the fucking government and rot the system. All those fake NDIS providers. The Health Department gets 125 billion, Social Security and Welfare 291 billion, Foreign Aid about 5.1 billion. Why? And ASIO about 1.1, which is interesting because I thought they got a hell of a lot more funding than that. Because government messaging consistently states that intelligence agencies must, quote, have the tools and powers necessary to keep Australians safe. But I guess, considering those numbers, ASIO doesn't have a lot of funding to work with. So maybe there's a legitimate argument why they need more funding. I'm not sure they need more powers though. Maybe they need more funding and they can do a better job. I don't know if they need to have these overarching Orwellian powers. Ministers regularly describe the threat environment, quote, as being complex and evolving. The government argues that intelligence agencies need stronger powers to respond to a rapidly evolving threat environment. The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security oversees agency conduct and legality. We've gone over the good and the bad of this new bill. In my opinion, it's more bad than good. We've looked at both sides of the debate, the for and against. In theory, it sounds great. The system should work how it's supposed to work. But in reality, we know these systems never quite turn out like they do on paper. So why is there such opposition to Amendment Bill No. 2? And it's not just conspiracy theorists and podcasters saying that this is a bad idea. When you have institutions like the Law Council of Australia who consistently argue that extraordinary powers require strict limits, independent oversight is essential to a system like this, and regular parliamentary review is necessary, I think we need to stand up and fucking listen. If they say that a system like this requires these oversights and these, more or less these restrictions, safeguards, whatever you want to call it, these review processes, we should be paying attention because ASIO and the government are saying they need more power to do their job. They essentially want to restrict or limit the limitations that were already put in place in Amendment Bill 1. They want to take the sunset clause away. They want to extend these powers even further into the future. They also want to get rid of the regular review process, which I think is really concerning. Maybe that's just to be efficient, but I'm not buying it. And I think any system like this needs to have regular reviews. It needs to be updated. It needs to be checked. It needs to have an independent investigative body that monitors it, not another government security-linked oversight service. The Law Council of Australia has warned that extraordinary powers require strict limits and ongoing oversight, and I think we really need to heed that warning, because that concerns me that they're concerned. Across news outlets, there has been consistent framing about the new bill relating to concerns about quote-unquote mission creep, and I had to look up what mission creep meant. According to Google, mission creep is the gradual, often unplanned expansion of a project or organization's original goals. It happens when initial successes or scope changes snowball, leading to extra tasks that ultimately dilute the original purpose and strain time, budget, and resources. Interesting. And that sounds like that is probably likely to happen with a system like this. There's also been warnings about expanding surveillance powers and the debate over balancing security and civil liberties. And this brings up probably the most important and crucial question surrounding the debate over Amendment Bill No. 2, and that is the democratic one. Democracies evolve through accumulation. Emergency laws, intelligence frameworks, surveillance systems, speech regulation systems, each are individually justified. But collectively, they raise a structural question. What happens when emergency architecture becomes permanent infrastructure? Now, the counterpoint to this, the government would argue Australia remains a fully functioning democracy, oversight mechanisms remain strong, Parliament retains full legislative control. When you look at the Muppets running the country, I have no faith that a system like this could work properly. Now, a certain sporting minister, Miss Annika Wells, has been caught up in another spending controversy. Last year, she spent a lot of taxpayers' money going to France so she could spend $1,600 on a dinner, going to the Olympics, paying for her husband to attend the AFL Grand Final. Apparently, she's a Brisbane supporter, and she brought tickets for him at the expense of the taxpayer. Now, she was very apologetic when she got caught and said it wouldn't happen again. But over the weekend, she's been found out to have spent more taxpayer money flying herself or family or friends, allegedly, don't quote me on it, to a 40th birthday party in a state. So if we have fuckheads like this who have a little bit of power, who are a nothing minister, the minister of sport, who really are a fucking pebble on a beach in terms of political power, if you have someone like that has been caught for spending taxpayer money, flying around the world, going to sporting events on the taxpayer's dime, treating taxpayer money like it's their own personal ATM, and while it's not illegal, apparently ministers can actually do this because it's not written anywhere that they can't. So it's a bit of a grey zone because, one, morally they shouldn't be using taxpayer money for personal reasons or for paying for sporting events or flights. There is no clause or law preventing ministers from doing this. It's more of a moral choice. And ministers like Miss Wells, she's not the only one, are in this position of power where they have access to taxpayer funds, and this is what they choose to do with it. So if power is so corrupting to a shit-kicking minister like the Minister of Sports, imagine what the corruption, the arrogance, and the mindset is of someone like a president or a prime minister who has, in their mind, ultimate unwielding power. No one can defend how much more aggressive Trump is second time around. The power has gone to his head even more so than it did the first time. He thinks he's untouchable. The PM had a couple of good years and now he thinks he can just do whatever he wants and piss in everyone's face. So if the Minister for Sport can do that, imagine what a government that isn't controlled, supervised, restricted, called into Parliament for a review process every 6 to 12 months to make sure a system like Bill 2 is running properly. Imagine what a system like that could do with absolutely no independent oversight. Yeah, there is the government oversight, but I don't trust that. Imagine what could go fucking wrong. It seems like every politician in the Western world and the third world and the second world is corrupt as fucking shit. Power corrupts, absolutely. And I have no faith that a system like this will not be corrupted and exploited and used to target people it was never intended to. I also argue that Australia is not a fucking functioning democracy anymore. As soon as they brought hate and fear speech laws in, this country wasn't a democracy. Yeah, well, fair enough. You can make the argument we didn't actually have free speech. We have political speech, which is a little different. But if you're not free to say what you like in an apparently quote-unquote free and democratic country without fear of going to jail for it, I would make the argument you're not living in a democracy. You're living in some type of proto-authoritative state. And to me, this brings up that age-old question of Orwellian parallels. Where have we heard laws and amendments like this before? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Orwell was right. He was just 40 years too early. Whenever governments expand surveillance powers, compulsory questioning powers, censorship laws, or intelligence authorities, comparisons are often made to George Orwell's 1984. And immediately people start to roll their eyes because the word Orwellian gets thrown around constantly online. If you spent any time on social media in the last couple of years, you've probably heard it. I've heard it a lot. But that doesn't mean it's not true and it's not happening. But the reason those comparisons keep returning is not because people think Australia is suddenly becoming some totalitarian nightmare overnight. It's because Orwell's warning was never really about one evil dictator. It was about the slow normalization of state power during periods of fear, instability, and permanent emergency. And if we look at the current state of the world, that's the time that we find ourselves in. Because since 9/11, we've been in this period of ever-increasing instability. Fear is everywhere. There's always something to be scared of, whether it's a fucking virus or a terrorist or a rogue state. There always seems to be some type of emergency. And if we know anything about how the world works, permanent emergency and fear is good. It keeps people complicit and it keeps people in check. A good fictional example of this is Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars Revenge of the Sith. He manages to stay in office even though his term is up. The war keeps going and he keeps extending emergency powers. Now, there may or may not be some real-world leaders that are using similar tactics to stay in power long after they should have been pensioned off. I do find that interesting. Permanent emergency is always justification to bring in new laws that normalise the new security landscape. In 1984, the population is told surveillance is necessary for security. Speech becomes regulated in the name of social stability. Language itself becomes politically dangerous, and the definition of what constitutes a threat constantly evolves depending on the needs of the state. Now, where have we heard that before? Surveillance is necessary for security. The Patriot Act, the new security laws that came in effect after 9/11, speech becomes regulated. There's definitely things you can and can't say in this country. There's things you absolutely cannot say if you don't want to go to jail, because there's been 2 people, I'm not sure if they've been charged yet, but they have been arrested for quote-unquote the new hate fear speech laws. There's a guy that got arrested at an Australia Day rally. He said some anti-Semitic remarks and he got arrested and he's been charged, and I think he was supposed to get 11 months in jail and he got 10 months in jail because I guess the judge was feeling lenient. And there was another woman recently in Brisbane that got arrested for having a banned slogan written on her t-shirt. I don't know what's happened with her. I don't know if she's been charged or not. But it does show you that these laws have come into effect and this is part of everyday life now. Language itself becomes politically dangerous. That's absolutely fucking true. You can't say certain things. You can't even say certain words without causing controversy, especially if you're in politics. Look at, next time you hear a politician talk, pay attention to what they do and don't say. I pay more attention to what they don't say rather than what they do, because whenever you hear them on the news, it's just word salad. They go around and around in circles. They never directly answer the question. It's always this word salad bullshit because they never want to commit to anything. If they can't commit to anything, that means they're not being honest and telling us the full story. The definition of what constitutes a threat constantly evolves depending on the needs of the state. And that goes back to those broad definitions in the amendments to Bill No. 2. The definitions have changed, they're more broader, so that gives them a bigger net to cast in order to, quote-unquote, catch security threats. That definitely relates to hybrid and cyber warfare. Now, to be clear, modern Australia is not Orwell's Oceania. We still have elections, for now, independent courts, journalists. I'm not sure our journalists are the best. I think a lot of them are ideologically captured and they're being brought and paid for, or they're trying to push some type of agenda to sell books. Oversight bodies and legal safeguards that authoritarian systems historically did not have. But critics argue the concern isn't where Australia is today. And that's also what concerns me. It's not so much what is happening right now. I am really concerned about the future and where things can head, because I've studied a lot of history, and not to toot my own horn, but I've studied history. I recognize the patterns. I have seen what has happened in other societies and at varying points throughout history, and it's not good. Whenever a nation goes down a certain path, ones like this where the state has absolute control, it doesn't lead anywhere good. And people just don't take an interest in history anymore. And it's really disturbing, because if you know your history, you know where you're going. And I always cringe at that argument whenever I hear someone say, well, history's boring. Why would I want to look into something that's happened in the past? So you can know where you're fucking going. If you don't recognize history and what has happened before, if you don't learn lessons from history, you're doomed to repeat them. The big concern is trajectory, because once extraordinary powers become permanent, they stop feeling extraordinary. They become a normal part of everyday life. And throughout history, governments almost never reduce their own powers voluntarily after crises pass. After terrorism comes counter-terror laws. After cyber threats comes digital surveillance expansion. After social unrest comes speech regulation. After foreign interference fears comes expanded intelligence authority. Each individual change may sound reasonable in isolation, but if critics warn the culminative effect slowly changes the relationship between citizens and the state itself, the fear is not one single law. The fear is the architecture being built over decades. And that is why the Orwell comparison continues to resonate with so many people. Fairly or unfairly, whenever democratic governments expand intelligence and security powers in the name of public safety. And I think we really need to think long and hard about these proposed new law changes. Now, the government will argue these reforms reflect a changing global threat environment. Civil liberties advocates will say these extraordinary powers should remain temporary, reviewable, and strictly limited. Both positions are coherent, but the issue is not the intent, it is the trajectory, as we've just seen. Because the question is not whether these powers exist today, it is what it means when they no longer expire. And I think that is the real scary thing. There is no expiry date, there is no sunset clause this time around, and that should concern all of us. So the question is not whether Australia is changing, the question is, what does a democracy become when its emergency powers stop ending. It's not whether Australia needs intelligence powers. It plainly does. The question is whether a democracy should keep making its most exceptional powers easier to use, harder to see, and more normal to live under. That is the line where security stops being a shield and starts becoming a habit. And looking at that question from an even more philosophical angle, so the real question becomes, what happens when emergency powers stop being temporary? Because democracies are rarely transformed in a single dramatic moment. More often, they change slowly, one law at a time, one crisis at a time, one expansion of power at a time. And every expansion is usually justified the same way. Protection, security, safety, stability. The danger is not simply authoritarianism. The danger is the gradual normalization of extraordinary powers until citizens no longer remember where the original limits once were. And history shows us something very uncomfortable. Governments are usually very good at acquiring new powers, but rarely enthusiastic about surrendering them. So maybe the question Australians really need to ask is not, do we trust the current government, but would we still be comfortable with these powers in the hands of a government we deeply distrust 10 years from now? Because laws outlive politicians, systems outlive crises, and powers created during fear rarely disappear when that fear itself fades. So what do you think? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Can you see the positive in the bill? Can you see where it can go horribly wrong? And how it could be used to target everyday citizens? Is it just the simple question of an expanded security bill, or is there something much darker lurking beneath the surface? And that brings us to the end of the show. I hope you all enjoyed it and got something out of it. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. If you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. You can head on over to Buy Me a Coffee. You can make a one-off payment or donate a recurring monthly amount. The amount's up to you, $1, $1,000, $100, $10, whatever you feel the show is worth. Every little bit helps keep the Truth Tank on the tracks and the lights on. You can also support the show by going to the brand new Truth Tank shop over on Spring. The link is in the description. You can get yourself some Truth Tank merch. You can get the MK1 t-shirt, the bucket hat, the baby onesie, the hoodie, the crew neck, the official Truth Tank truth cap. You can support the show and look really cool doing it. You can download and listen to your favorite episodes of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Pandora, YouTube, Audible, Amazon Music, Castbox, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you get podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread the word and get the Truth Tank out there. You can leave a 5-star rating and review on your preferred podcast player. Every review helps the show grow and get found. Follow and like the Truth Tank on Instagram and Facebook. And I'll be back in the next week or two with a brand new episode. But until then, I'm the Tank. This is the truth. Truth to tell.